He knew that some among them were potentially dangerous.
This policy analysis is going to focus on RCW 43.17.425 and some of the shortcomings in this policy that allow state and local law enforcement to collaborate with federal immigration agencies, and how this negatively impacts the migrant worker population in Washington state. But first, we're going to go through the history of migrant workers in Washington state back about 80 years ago to 1942.
Some among them were potentially dangerous, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
As Japanese residents in Washington state were interned, citizens and aliens alike, Bracero workers were brought in from Mexico on a provisional basis to work in the agricultural and mining fields principally. While these workers were granted provisional residency in America, they were not granted constitutional protections and did not have the ability to seek recourse for the abusive work conditions and poor living conditions that they endured.
Al fin de todo, salí del bote con muchas ganas de ver a mi chencha.
It's important to understand that the state's role in immigration policy has been to facilitate the flow of capital. So, as these workers were let in provisionally, there was really no thought given to a path to citizenship and how they could potentially add to the collective tax base. There was just concern given to the interest of these firms who would be benefiting from indentured labor. I'd say that the state is failing these people. It's actually doing its job. It's keeping these people in a state of limbo where they cannot be full citizens, but they can find employment here. And as a result of that, they have to traverse the border and come back and forth. These residents in Washington state specifically make more frequent trips back and forth, send more money back per capita, and a higher percentage of them begin as legally documented.
Al fin de todo, salí del bote con muchas ganas de ver a mi chencha.
While undocumented migrant workers are allowed to seek employment in the United States, there is currently no federal path to citizenship for the greater majority of them. And as such, while traversing the border to send money back and forth, they are subject to being detained and deported. This has deleterious effects on the locales they are reported back to. As a study by Russell et al. Shows, there's a 4 to 8% increase in observed homicide rates in the locales they are deported back to. Deportees are also common targets of violent victimization in these locales. RCW 43.17.425 has three major shortcomings. The first of which is it does not go far enough to prohibit collaboration between state, local, and federal law enforcement agencies. The second is that it does not prohibit enforcement actions from occurring on courthouse steps or other government property. The third is that it does not prohibit the use of federally interoperable databases like the access system used by the Washington State Patrol. This is a letter from Justice Mary E. Fairhurst, Chief Justice of the Washington State Supreme Court, to Kevin K. McAleenan, Commissioner of the United States Customs and Border Protection. In this letter, she outlines how these joint enforcement actions at courthouses have, quote, impeded the fundamental mission of our courts, which is to ensure due process and access to justice for everyone, regardless of their immigration status, whether such persons were victims in need of protection from domestic violence, witnesses summoned to testify, or families who may be in crisis. Aside from collaboration between local, state, law enforcement, and federal agencies to apprehend defendants at courthouses, there have also been instances of corrections and law enforcement officers directly transmitting information about detainees and defendants to federal agencies, such as the Richland Police Department, who sent names and addresses and immigration status of individuals they'd apprehended to ICE. The Franklin County and Clark County Correctional Centers also send weekly reports to federal agencies which contain the country of origin for inmates, which could be an indicator for them to investigate that individual further to see what their immigration status is.
We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous.
Washington State should not allow federal agencies to access immigration data that is input into the access system about defendants and detainees. Washington State should ensure that when federal agencies are accessing databases for inmates and defendants in Washington State, that their immigration data is not available. Command level accountability should be enforced for law enforcement and corrections officers who willingly transmit inmates and defendants' data to federal agencies. Finally, courts and other state buildings should be prohibited from being used as sites to apprehend and detain people based on their immigration status.
We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous.